Okay, we're back again to do some year three material. We're going to be looking at Jordan Peterson, and one of the things we're going to do on Saturdays is just spend about 45 minutes of his talk and maybe an hour and a half total, although we're getting a late start, so we'll see how that works, of listening to his Bible lectures and seeing what we get out of it. So this is where we left off, and we'll continue here.
And so it's not obvious that the abstraction is less real than the more concrete reality. And you take a work of fiction like Hamlet and you think, well, is that, it's not true because it's fiction. But then you think, wait a minute, what kind of explanation is that? Like maybe it's more true than nonfiction because it takes what the story that needs to be told about you and the story that needs to be told about you and you and you and you and abstracts that out and says, look, here's something that's a key part of the human experience as such, right? So it's an abstraction from this underlying noisy substrate. And people are affected by it because they see that the thing that's represented is part of the pattern of their being. That's the right way to think about it. And then with these old stories, these ancient stories, it seems to me like that process has been occurring for thousands of years. It's like we watched ourselves and we extracted out some stories. We imitated each other and we represented that in drama, and then we distilled the drama and we got a representation of the distillation, and then we did it again. And at the end of that process, that took God only knows how long. I think some of these stories, they've traced fairy tales back 10,000 years, some fairy tales, in relatively unchanged form. And it certainly seems to me that the archaeological evidence, for example, suggests that the really old stories that the Bible begins with are at least that old and likely embedded in a prehistory that's far older than that. And you might think, well, how can you be so sure? And the answer to that in part is that cultures that don't change, like the ancient cultures, right? They didn't change as fast as this. They stay the same. That's the answer. So they keep their information moving generation to generation. That's how they stay the same. And so we know, again, in the archaeological record, there are records of rituals that have remained relatively unbroken for up to 20,000 years. It was discovered in caves in Japan that were set up for a particular kind of bear worship that was also characteristic of Western Europe. So these things can last for very long periods of time. We're watching each other act in the world. And then the question is, well, how long have we been watching each other? And the answer to that, in some sense, is, well, as long as there's been creatures with nervous systems. And that's a long time, you know, that's some hundreds of millions of years, perhaps longer than that. We've been watching each other, trying to figure out what we're up to across that entire span of time. And some of that knowledge is built right into our bodies, which is why we can dance with each other, for example, right? Because understanding isn't just something that you have as an abstraction, it's something that you act out, you know? That's what children are doing when they're learning to rough and tumble play, is they're learning to integrate their body with the body of someone else in a harmonious way, learning to cooperate and compete, and that's all instantiated right into their body. It's not abstract knowledge. They don't know that they're doing that, they're just doing it. And so we can even use our body as a representational platform. So we've been studying each other for a long time, abstracting out what is it that we're up to, and that's what is it we're up to? What should we be up to? That's even a more fundamental question. If you're going to live in the world and you're going to do it properly, what does properly mean? And how is it that you might go about that? Well, it's the right question, right? It's what everyone wants to know. How do you live in the world? Not what is the world made of? It's not the same question. How do you live in the world? It's the eternal question of human beings. And I guess we're the only species that has ever really asked that question, because all the other animals, they just go and do whatever they do. Not us. It's a question for us. We have to become aware of it. We have to be able to speak it. God only knows why. But that seems to be the situation. So we act. That acting is shaped by the world. That acting is shaped by society into something that we don't understand, but that we can model. We model it in our stories. We model it with our bodies. And that's where the dream gets its information. The dream is part of the process that's watching everything and then trying to formulate it and trying to say, well, trying to get the signal out from the noise and to portray it in dramatic form, because a dream is a little drama. And then you get the chance to talk about what that dream is. And then you have something like articulated knowledge at that point. And so the Bible, I would say, it's sort of, it exists in that space that's half into the dream and half into articulated knowledge. It's something like that. And going into it to find out what the stories are about can, what it can aid our self-understanding. And then the other issue is that if Nietzsche was correct, and if Dostoevsky or Jung was correct, and Dostoevsky as well, we, without the cornerstone that that understanding provides, we're lost. And that's not good, because then we're susceptible to psychic pathology. That's psychological pathology. You know, the people who are adamant anti-religious thinkers seem to believe that if we abandoned our immersement in the underlying dream, that we'd all instantly become rationalists like Descartes or Bacon, or, you know, intelligent, clear-thinking, rational, scientific people. And I don't believe that for a moment, because I don't think there's any evidence for it. I think we would become so irrational so rapidly that the weirdest mysteries of Catholicism would seem positively rational by contrast. And I think that's already happening. So, okay. So this is the idea, essentially, you know, that you have the unknown world. That's just what you don't know at all. That's the outside. That's the ocean that surrounds the island that you inhabit, something like that. It's chaos itself. And then you act in that world, and you act in ways you don't understand. There's more to your actions than you can understand. One of the things Jung said, I loved this when I first understood it. He said, everybody acts out a myth, but very few people know what their myth is. And you should know what your myth is, because it might be a tragedy, and maybe you don't want it to be. And that's really worth thinking about, because you have a pattern of behavior that characterizes you, you know, and God only knows where you got it. Partly it's biological, partly it's from your parents, it's your unconscious assumptions, it's the way the philosophy of your society has shaped you, and it's aiming you somewhere. Well, is it aiming you somewhere you want to go? That's a good question. That's part of self-realization, you know. We know we don't understand our actions. That's almost every argument you have with someone is about that. It's like, why did you do that? You come up with some half-baked reasons why you did it. You're flailing around in the darkness, you know, you try to give an account for yourself, but you can only do it partially. It's very, very difficult, because you're a complicated animal with the beginnings of an articulated mind, something like that. And you're just way more than you can handle. And all right, so you act things out, right? You act things out. And that's a kind of competence. And then you imagine what you act out, and you imagine what everyone else acts out. And so there's a tremendous amount of information in your action. And then that information is translated up into the dream.
So a couple of quick points as we just dive back into his way of thinking. It's kind of a pain that we have to break up this lecture of his instead of doing it all in one go. But his first point is this idea that, okay, cultures that don't change remain the same. Well, implicit in that is his view that, well, how he's saying that that's the evidence that their story didn't change, because he sees a connection between the stories around which the tribes are orienting themselves as the language that they use to understand who they are in relationship to each other and neighboring tribes and to the divine and nature and all of that stuff. That's what the stories are about. So they orient their art and their plays and their drama and their music and everything around those stories, which clearly they do. And he's saying, well, those stories are informing them of how to be in the world. And if the way that they are in the world, if their sense of values and their behaviors and their technologies and everything are unchanged for 10,000 years, that's evidence that they were successful at preserving an unchanged story. Now, there's another view that somebody might have in this, a Marxist, materialist, anti-Peterson perspective, which would be something like, what makes people change is their physical reality. And so the stories aren't making the people able to be what they are. They're just a reflection of the fact that the people had to relate to their neighbors in a certain way and fit in it. So nothing changed for them. And then when external physical realities changed because new technology was available or trade routes, where it's always boils down to economic materialist perspective, whatever changed made them change their stories. So I'm not advocating that. But what I'm saying is, what's important about this point, because we looked at Nietzsche and we looked at Jung, and now he's justifying narrative off the back of those things. And he's saying, look, the way it seems to me is that people have a deep need for a story that says you are a character and you have a place to go. And there's a lot to figure out, but the way you're going to navigate it is best described in this language, in this narrative language of a character moving from point A to point B and coming across other characters, which are obstacles or aids to getting there and figuring out the right way to aim and all of that. That story had to come first. And that's what made it possible for poop throwing, rock wielding apes to start building cathedrals and to start building pyramids and to start developing. The technology comes as an after effect of us working out consciously our dream story. Not that we're conscious of the fact that we're working it out, by the way, but working out what can impress upon our consciousness. So it's an effect on the type of shared dream that we have about who we are in the world. And then these neighboring tribes are fighting it out. My dream's better than your dream. My God is stronger than your God, is the way that they might put it. But they're fighting it out. They're competing it out. They're also, it's not just that, they're borrowing from one another. They're learning insightful things and sticky things about each other's stories through cooperation and through trade. But in a sense, it's like, instead of a conscious person sitting down and working out a philosophy, what's happening is 10,000 years perhaps of people working out their story is what's happening. And that is prior to the technological developments. It's prior to the cultural achievements. And it's expressed in those cultural achievements. All right. So we're not going to debate either side of that. What we're noticing, all I meant, unless anybody wants to debate it, all I'm noticing is that's key to his perspective of what it is that we're doing when we're examining ancient stories like the Bible mythology. I'm not saying myth to say it's not true, but I'm saying the Bible narrative might be a better word without the wrong connotations, right? He's saying, let's go study these stories because they're foundational to the way we dream about who we are and our art, and it made possible the invention of science, and all of this other stuff comes after dreaming and wrestling with what the appropriate, or let's say the clearest perspective of who we are in a narrative context that presumes subjectivity rather than tries to objectify everything, right? One of the common criticisms from a scientism age is, look at these ancient morons, they're personifying everything. Ooh, the wind blows, that must be an agent that's blowing because it has intentions, and we mock it as if it's valueless. What Peterson's doing is not throwing science away, of course, but what he's doing is saying, look, that's an illegitimate throwing away of, from his perspective, of something that could be deeply, profoundly valuable. And we might be relying upon it so much that our science wouldn't even be possible if we just discarded it. So I won't ramble about that anymore, but that point is worth noticing because he's setting the stage. He hasn't even gotten to Genesis 1:1 yet, right? But he's setting the stage with his Nietzsche point and with his Jung point, which has led into this perspective on narrative, and the potentially legitimate and necessary role, in his view, fundamentally necessary role that type of language plays. And we might imagine, like, okay, imagine we're a bunch of, I mean, we had a common ancestor with the chimpanzees, right? If we're just going to adopt the scientific materialistic perspective on things, I don't want to quarrel with that. Let's say we had a common ancestor with the chimpanzees. Okay, well, what happened? The chimpanzees are doing great. They're fitting in their niche just fine. They're not inventing new technology. They have some social structure. They do teach each other some things, but we know they don't have language exactly. We know they're more sophisticated than like Cartesian robots, perhaps, but they're certainly not doing what we're up to. And the gentle suggestion, which I don't want to put words in Peterson's mouth, but what might be hinted at here or implicitly either suggested, or at least it's not a far stretch, would be to say something like, look, we're in these caves and there's these bears we got to get rid of, and there's these neighboring warlike tribes, and we're trying to work things out and get enough food for everybody. There's fragile and vulnerable members of our society, and we're trying to organize the hunt, and these are the things we're concerned with. And what the heck are we doing? We're making paintings. Right? So the materialistic inclination or the scientism inclination for the story is to say, well, what we did is we were like that, but then we eventually invented enough technology that we could have a caloric surplus and we've got lots of food. And now we can waste our time or enjoy our time in these diversions of art and poetry and things like that. It's like maybe, or maybe you need a lot of statues of Venus. You need something that you can look at that says, hey, this is the way you're relating to this is going to tell you something about who you are in the world and what you have to think about as valuable and what matters. And here's some paintings of some other animals. And like, they're emotionally very significant. We could pull some up and look at them if we want to. We do that in the year 2 backbone course, but we won't do that right now because I don't want to waste your time looking it up. But these are really deeply emotionally profound as far as I can tell. They seem profound more than just emotionally profound. They're very profound works of art. And one of the perspectives is to say, okay, we didn't know what we were doing perhaps, but getting that dream clearer and using the proper language of dream, which is not scientific because dreams, this is back to his Jungian point, they don't follow temporal and spatial rules. In dreams, things appear and disappear and fly around and you're in a different place. That is actually the language of art. In art, you can see different depictions of the same thing, and it's not following spatial temporal rules all the time. But that's the proper language, or the proper language, I should say, of dealing with those very deep psychological things that we want to try to get right and orient properly in the world, could be fundamental to exploding and developing in the ways that we have, perhaps. And so it's a completely reverse perspective of the more commonly told story of, well, we developed some technology and now we do art because that's fun too. All right, I won't belabor the point. We'll, unless you have something to say, we'll continue with the video. That makes sense though, right? As far as understanding his perspective, I mean.
Yeah,
All
it
right,
does.
let's let the great man talk then, and I'll stop babbling.
And into art, into mythology and literature, and there's a tremendous amount of information in that. And then some of that is translated into articulated thought. And I'll give you a quick example of something like that. I think this is partly what happens in Exodus when Moses comes up with the law. You know, he's wandering around with the Israelites forever in the desert, and they're like going left and going right and worshiping idols and like having a hell of a time, and you know, getting rebellious. And Moses goes up in the mountain and he has this tremendous revelation sort of in the sight of God, and it illuminates him, and he comes down with the law. You think, well, you know, Moses acted as a judge. I know this is a mythological story. Moses acted as a judge in the desert. He was continually mediating between people who are having problems, constantly trying to keep peace. And so what are you doing when you're trying to keep peace? Is you're trying to understand what peace is, right? You have to apply the principles. Well, what are the principles? Well, you don't know. The principles are whatever satisfies people enough to make peace. And maybe you do that 10,000 times, and then you get some sense of, oh, here's the principles that bring peace. And then one day it blasts into your consciousness like a revelation. Here's the rules that we're already acting out. Well, that's the 10 Commandments. They're there to begin with. And Moses comes forward and says, look, this is already basically what we're doing, but now it's codified, right? And like, that's all a historical process that's condensed into a single story. But obviously that happened because we have written law, right? And that emerged in good legal systems. That emerges from the bottom up. That's English common law is exactly like that, right? It's single decisions that are predicated on principles that are then articulated and made into the body of law. And the body of law is something you act out. That's why it's a body of law. If you're a good citizen, you act out the body of law. And the body of law has principles. Okay, so the question is, there's principles that guide our behavior. What are those principles? Well, I think if you want the initial answer of what the archaic Israelites meant by God, that's something like what they meant. Now, it's not a good enough explanation, but look, imagine that you're a chimpanzee and you have a powerful dominant figure at the pinnacle of your society. That represents power. Now, more than that, because it's not sheer physical prowess that keeps a chimp at the top of the hierarchy. It's much more complicated than that. But you could say, well, there's a principle that the dominant person manifests. And then you might say, well, that principle shines forth even more brightly if you know 10 people who are dominant, powerful. Then you can extract out what dominance means from that. You can extract out what power means from that. And then you can divorce the concept from the people. And we had to do that at some point because we can say power in a human context and we can imagine what that means, but it's divorced from any specific manifestation of power. Well, how the hell did we do that? Like, that's so complicated. If you're a chimp, the power is in another chimp. It's not some damn abstraction. Well, so the question is, think about it. We're in these hierarchies, many of them across centuries. We're trying to figure out what the guiding principle is. We're trying to extract out the core of the guiding principle. And we turn that into a representation of a pattern of being. Well, it's something like that. That's God. It's an abstracted ideal. And it's put in personified form. It manifests itself in personified form, but that's okay because what we're trying to get at is in some sense, the essence of what it means to be a properly functioning and properly functioning, properly social, and properly competent individual. You're trying to figure out what that means. You need an embodiment, you need an ideal that's abstracted that you could act out that would enable you to understand what that means. And that's what we've been driving at. So that's the first hypothesis in some sense. I'm going to go over some of the attributes of this abstracted ideal that we formalized as God. But that's the first sort of hypothesis, is that a philosophical or moral ideal manifests itself first as a concrete pattern of behavior that's characteristic of a single individual. And then it's a set of individuals. And then it's an abstraction from that set. And then you have the abstraction. It's so important. So here's a political implication, for example. One of the debates, we might say, between early Christianity and the late Roman Empire was whether or not an emperor could be God, literally, right? To be deified, to be put in a temple. And you can see why that might happen, because that's someone at the pinnacle of a very steep hierarchy who has a tremendous amount of power and influence. But the Christian response to that was, never confuse the specific sovereign with the principle of sovereignty itself. It's brilliant. You see how difficult it is to come up with an idea like that, so that even the person who has the power is actually subordinate to something else. Subordinate to, let's call it a divine principle, for lack of a better word. So that even the king himself is subordinate to the principle. And we still believe that because we believe that our president, our prime minister, is subordinate to the damn law, whatever the body of law, right? There's a principle inside that even the leader is subordinate to. And without that, you could argue you can't even have a civilized society, because your leader immediately turns into something that's transcendent and all-powerful. And I mean, that's certainly what happened in the Soviet Union and what happened in Maoist China and what happened in Nazi Germany, because there was nothing for the powerful to subordinate themselves to. You're supposed to be subordinate to God. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to tear that idea apart, but partly what it means is that you're subordinate, even if you're sovereign, to the principle of sovereignty itself. And then the question is, what the hell is the principle of sovereignty? And I could say we have been working that out for a very long period of time. And so that's one of the things that we'll talk about, because the ancient Mesopotamians and the ancient Egyptians had some very interesting, dramatic ideas about that. So, just for example, very briefly, there was a deity known as Marduk. And Marduk, he was a Mesopotamian deity. And imagine this is sort of what happened, is that as an empire...
I didn't realize I was not on mute. I'm sorry about the typing. This is really exciting. So now we're going to get into him approaching one myth. And before he does, I just want to say, one of the things we're trying to do, of course, in these courses when we're looking at any of the authors, is we just want to understand their perspective. Well, this is really key. Jordan has, well, he wrote Maps of Meaning, right? He has a perspective about all the, it's let's call it a, oh, shoot, maybe that won't be an appropriate term. He's doing an analysis of this language of narrative, and it's if the narrative language is fundamentally non-propositional, he's having a propositional discussion about it. So we could call it the philosophy of the meaning of the narrative itself, right? So it's not the psychology of the role that the narrative is playing in culture. It's actually engaging with that narrative and trying to put into articulated form propositions, which are, of course, not narrative. They could be expressed in a narrative context, which he would also affirm, and which he affirms when he's talking to people who deny that, even about the things that they're saying. But he's trying to bring it into the realm of stuff that we can argue philosophically or understand or come close to comprehending, or at least use the light of those stories to point at things that we might be able to try to speak. And so this Marduk story is really powerful. I think this is uh, it plays a central and fundamental role to the way he views the cosmos and it's wisdom, if it's correct, but it's wisdom that he's gotten from an examination of the stories. So this, since we haven't gotten to Genesis 1:1 yet, we're going to restart at the beginning right now of the Mesopotamian myth, and we're just going to listen through to the way that he engages with it, wrestles with it. Uh, what was the word I was just going to use? The way he the way he terminological. So we're going to look at the way he approaches the myth, right, with a great deal of humility and with an idea that there could be something true there, but what's true about it won't come in a propositional form, and the humility with which he attempts to extract propositional truth from it without ever saying that the story itself could be reduced to the propositions that he's trying to extract from it, right? So he's using this Jungian and Nietzschean perspective, this embodied idea, this existentialist idea, the pragmatic approach. He's using all of these philosophical lenses, and then he's saying, okay, philosophy's great. Science is great. He's a clinical psychologist. What happens if I try to be intellectually and academically respectable and I try to approach something here that I think might be too profound for words? How can I use words to talk about it or to maybe partially extract something that can at least be played with in the realm that we've been playing in of philosophy, which is we're going to say, well, okay, you think you got that from the story, but is it self-contradictory? Does it lead to absurd conclusions, right? We're going to use the games of philosophy now because those are the proper games for adjudicating anything propositional. But he's going to be, and of course, just because we claim the propositional idea comes from myth doesn't mean that it's also superior to our propositional game. Once it's propositional, it's subject to, ethicists and everybody arguing about consequences and science and anything relevant that can be said there. But in his view, there's this deep, profound well of stuff that will never exhaust. We're never going to get to the bottom of it. We're not going to reduce King Lear to a simple morality lesson that can be said in 2 sentences or 18 paragraphs or anything like that. But there's stuff that's valuable there that we're going to get out of it. So in any case, let's watch him do that with the Marduk story, because I think this is pretty powerful. And also it plays a core role in his view of the cosmos, right? So he's getting it from that realm. He's realizing that all of these myths are seeming to get at something, and he's trying to extract what it is that they're getting at from engaging with the stories in the, again, there's a way to engage in scientific ideas. You say, show me the evidence, let's set up an experiment. There's a way to engage in philosophical ideas. It's let's make an argument. Can you defend it against criticism with propositional language? The way to engage with narrative ideas might be a little bit different. And one of the fun things about this lecture series is it contains within it an entire course on Jungian approaches to narrative, right? It's in there, hidden in there, and he's going to exhibit for us how it is that he's going to use these attitudes to approach the biblical stories. So, without further ado, let's say,
Mesopotamia, a deity known as
right, he's
Marduk.
going to retell the
And
story and
Marduk,
get stuff out of it. Let's
he
go.
was a Mesopotamian deity. And imagine this is sort of what happened, is that as an empire grew out of the post-Ice Age, say 15,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, all these tribes came together, and these tribes each had their own deity, their own image of the ideal, but then they started to occupy the same territory, right? And so then one tribe had God A and one tribe had God B, and one could wipe the other one out, and then it would just be God A who wins. But that's not so good because, well, maybe you want to trade with those people, or maybe you don't want to lose half your population in a war, something like that. So then you have to have an argument about whose God is going to take priority, which ideal is going to take priority. And what seems to happen is that's represented in mythology as a battle of the gods in sort of celestial space. But from a practical perspective, it's more like an ongoing dialogue. You believe this, I believe this. You believe that, I believe this. How are we going to meld that together? So you take God A and you take God B, and maybe what you do is extract God C from them. And you say, well, God C now has the attributes of A and B. And then some other tribes come in, and then C takes them over too. And so you get, like with Marduk, for example, he has a multitude of names, 50 different names. Well, those are names, at least in part, of the subordinate gods that represented the tribes that came together to make the civilization. That's part of the process by which that abstracted ideal is abstracted. You think this is important, and it works because your tribe's alive. And you think this is important, and it works because your tribe is alive. And so we'll take the best of both if we can manage it, and extract out something that's even more abstract that covers both of us if we can do it. And one of the things that's really interesting about Marduk.
Okay, so before he gets into the story to exhibit how to do it, he actually is talking about something really important here. It could be correct, it might not be. We'll have all the debates and talk about it, but let's talk about what he's saying here, which is, okay, we said in science, let's set up an experiment and see if we can take these ideas and resolve them with some empirical consequence. In philosophy, we're going to use the laws of logic and right reason. We're going to set up arguments and see how that plays itself out. What is the equivalent for the narrative? Is it just stories and anybody makes up any story and it's just as good as any story? Well, Savad might like the fact that there's an implicit pragmatic approach in part of his understanding here. He's saying, well, if your tribe is alive, if your tribe is oriented in how to relate to all of the threats that can come from nature and from other tribes and from the divine, perhaps, and you're thriving to any degree and you're still here, that's enough evidence for us to say there might be some truth in your story. And from the perspective of a neighboring tribe with a slightly different story. And he says, well, one of the ways, now this is what's interesting because in science, you can sort of have a scientific career where you incorporate the rules, you try to live according to them, you try to do your work according to them, and you put it in front of peer review. And there's all of this conversation that's happening there, but you can sort of internalize the process by which you make progress in science. The same with philosophy, right? Nietzsche can come along and write a whole book. Kant can come along and say, here's my whole philosophy. I can incorporate the rules of right thinking. I can apply myself, and here it goes. What's being suggested here is that the rules of editing and sophisticating and developing these ancient, profound, mythological underpinning stories is not usually internalized by a single person. Instead, it's being played out historically. It's almost like these dreams, which again, where do our dreams come from? Well, they come from our subconscious or something. Okay. But what is that? Well, it's the product of natural selection. It's what the whole of the cosmos has written into our subconscious through the billions of years of evolving things that fit in well with it. That's where it comes from. You might just use the phrase divine revelation if you wanted to, right? That term no longer seems like a ridiculous term anymore if it could at least mean that much, and that's something that we're wrestling with. That's something that we have access to. Well, where did it come from? It came from nature killing things that didn't fit in well with it. Okay, what fit in well with it? Creatures who dream about dragons. What the fuck? Creatures who, if we want to be radical Darwinians, if we want to do this William Jamesian radical embrace of empiricism or of Darwinism, and the pragmatists are doing, we say, okay, I am the mirror image of what fits in well with my environment. That's the formula. Okay, I am a creature with I am a creature to whom it's like to be something, and narrative speaks to me, and I dream about dragons. And all cultures, I think around the age of 7, no matter what culture you're living in, the children dream about dragons. So we won't talk more about dragons. I'm sure Peterson will later. But okay. So so if that's what's shaping our subconscious to create our dreams, what's shaping our actual written plays and paintings and stories? And what he's saying is, well, it's not that you have to internally what have we always been saying? The artist is divinely possessed. They're getting inspiration from the muses. Okay. We read Ion, where Socrates is talking to an artist who doesn't understand that that's how he's doing what he's doing. And often artists don't understand how it is that they can do what they do. But one of the perspectives that's been pretty popular and has been around for a long time, even within philosophy, is these people are good dreamers. They're getting in touch with something that seems to be a language from something beyond just stuff that we've got our minds wrapped around and things that we can argue. And so he's saying, okay, how are these stories edited? Well, if there's a unique story that only one tribe believes and that tribe dies out in one generation, that story is no longer here. Okay. So one of the ways that stories can be preserved is through mimetics. If the story is memorable, it will be remembered, and whatever is not memorable about it will be forgotten by definition. So the stories are, I tell my child, and he tells his child, and he tells his child. And, whatever was stupid about the way I told the story is what's not remembered when the story is recounted. But the core of the story is only the part that does progress is just psychologically what is memorable. So that's one way. But another way is to say, okay, well, what if these two tribes have radically different values that come from their story of what the ultimate God principle is, or something like that? Well, one way they might settle it is not to internalize the fact that this is what they're doing at all, but to fight with each other until they wipe out one of the tribes. And this is bloody and horrible, and nobody's endorsing it, but history is bloody and horrible. And what we're saying is the editor isn't the person who compiled the story or advocated the story or the general who led the troops in defense of the story. The editor of the story is the cosmos itself, playing it out, saying this story is no longer going to be told anymore, because, or if the story makes you relate to nature in such a way that you die, well, then you're not preserving the story. So that's one way. But then he says it's not all that horrible, because actually what happens is a lot of beautiful cooperation between cultures where they're interacting with each other. So now I've heard something that I've never heard before in your story, and I can't get rid of it. And so now it becomes a part of my story because I see it as a truth, not about the word you used for your God, perhaps, but it's definitely true about my God because it's something I can't get rid of and I can't shake. It's a powerful story. So there's this like mimetics, bloody history, and cultural cooperation and clashing that is going into 10,000 years, 100,000 years of story revision without there having to be one single genius Shakespeare, meta Shakespeare storyteller who sits down and just writes it. Right. One of the materialist, scientismist criticisms of fundamentalist religion is that in our post-Cartesian scientism world, what they want to say is something like the Bible was written in one sitting by God who spoke it to us and we wrote it down, or something like that. And the criticism is that didn't happen. Look, part of the source came from here, and part of the source came from here, and part of it came from here. And so there's a lot of fundamentalist Christians who maybe are very serious about their faith. They go to seminary and they start studying the history of how the Bible took its present form, say, since we're going to talk about the Bible here, and they lose their faith and they have a crisis of faith because they're like, wait a minute, I thought this was God handed us a book. What Peterson's doing is what the fundamentalists might do is reject it and say, hey, that's too much of a challenge for me. I reject it. No, God just inspired this book and it didn't come from different sources and it doesn't have this history. What the pragmatists and the existentialists and the William Jamesian types and the Jungians and Jordan Peterson, what this group is doing is they're completely embracing everything about that and saying, holy shit, do you realize the consequences of saying that the cosmos wrote the book is pretty goddamn close to the idea that something larger than any single individual with inspiration could have possibly done? And then he says, okay, I'm going to tell you about a story and I'm going to try to do this process I talked about extracting stuff that we can talk about that's meaningful from that story, since the story he suspects is deeply, profoundly about who we are and how we should live and how to be oriented in the world. Well, okay, so how does that process happen? And part of the answer is something called revelation. And so he's talking about this idea of we're meditating on the story for 100,000 years, and then and they say we're watching each other and how we behave and what the rules are by which we're behaving, and we're doing it in story and in art and meditating on it. And then all of a sudden somebody has an insight where they go, I get it, we're obeying the 10 commandments. And then they write that down, and that's like a flash of inspiration, but it was all written in there to begin with, in a sense. But now it's no longer just a dream thing that I feel is important, which by the way, it might just be unbelievably important, but I orient myself towards it because it's in my culture and in my art, but now I can actually talk about it. And so that revelation moment, he's identifying not as the revelation of getting the good dream, which is a different kind of revelation, but this moment of revelatory understanding where it can be articulated is a part of the mechanism he's identifying of the shift between, pulling out what it is we've been talking about without realizing we've been talking about it in this other language. So with that, hopefully, and I think he's about to get into the story of Marduk. So let's see what he says here. This is how he's going to approach the Bible stories.
I'll just give you a couple of his features, but
Okay, here we go.
he has eyes all the way around his head. He's elected by all the other gods to be king god. So that's the first thing. That's quite cool. And they elect him because they're facing a terrible threat, sort of like a flood and a monster combined, something like that. And Marduk basically says that if they elect him top god, then he'll go out and stop the flood monster, and they won't all get wiped out. It's a serious threat. It's chaos itself making its comeback. And so all the gods agree. And Marduk is a new manifestation. He's got eyes all the way around his head, and he speaks magic words. And then he also goes out, and when he fights this deity called Tiamat. And we need to know that because the word Tiamat is associated with the word Tehom, Tehom. And Tehom is the chaos that God makes order out of at the beginning of time in Genesis. So it's linked very tightly to this story. And Marduk, with his eyes and his capacity to speak magic words, goes out to confront Tiamat, who's like a watery sea dragon, something like that. It's a classic St. George story to go out and wreak havoc on the dragon. And he cuts her into pieces, and he makes the world out of her pieces. And that's the world that human beings live in. And the Mesopotamian emperor acted out Marduk. He was allowed to be emperor insofar as he was a good Marduk. And so that meant that he had eyes all the way around his head, and he could speak magic. He could speak properly. And so that we're starting to understand there at that point the essence of leadership, right? Because what's leadership? It's the capacity to see what the hell's in front of your face and maybe in every direction, and then the capacity to use your language properly in a transformative manner and to transform chaos into order. And God only knows how long it took the Mesopotamians to figure that out, and the best they could do is dramatize it, but it's staggeringly brilliant. It's by no means obvious, and this chaos is a very strange thing, and this is the chaos that God wrestled with at the beginning of time. Chaos is it's half psychological and half real. There's no other way to really describe it. The chaos is what you encounter when you're thrown into deep confusion, right? When your world falls apart, when you encounter something that blows you into pieces, when your dreams die, when you're betrayed. It's the chaos that emerges, and the chaos is everything at once, and it's too much for you, and that's for sure. And it pulls you down into the underworld, and all. That's where the dragons are, and all you've got at that point is your capacity to bloody well keep your eyes open and to speak as carefully and clearly as you can. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll get through it that way and come out the other side. And it's taken people a very long time to figure that out. And it looks to me like the idea is erected on the platform of our ancient ancestors, maybe tens of millions of years ago, because we seem to represent that which disturbs us deeply, using the same system that we use to represent like serpentile or other carnivorous predators. And we're biological creatures, right? So when we've formulated our capacity to abstract, our strange capacity to abstract and use language, we still have all those underlying systems that were there when we were only animals. And we have to use those systems. They're part of the emotional and motivational architecture of our thinking. And part of the reason we can demonize our enemies who upset our axioms is because we perceive them as if they're carnivorous predators. We do it with the same system. And that's chaos itself, the thing that always threatens us, right? The snakes that came to the trees when we lived in them like 60 million years ago. It's the same damn systems. So the Marduk story is partly the story of using attention and language to confront those things that most threaten us. And some of those things are real world threats, but some of them are psychological threats, which are just as profound, but far more abstract. But we use the same systems to represent them. It's why you freeze if you're frightened, right? You're a prey animal. You're like a rabbit. You've seen something that's going to eat you, you freeze. And that way you're paralyzed. You're turned to stone, which is what you do when you see a Medusa with a head full of snakes, right? You're turned to stone, you're paralyzed. And the reason you do that is because you're using the predator detection system to protect yourself. Your heart rate goes way up and you get ready to move. Things that upset us rely on that system. And then the story, the Marduk story, for example, is the idea that if there are things that upset you, chaotic, terrible, serpentine, monstrous, underworld things that threaten you, the best thing to do is to open your eyes and get your speech organized and go out and confront the thing and make the world out of it. And it's
So we've done a few classes before. I think this might have been before you showed up, Savad, into this thing. But we talked a lot about the Apollo and Daphne story, which is also about the exact same thing. Um, he, were you there for any of those? I think we did them in spaces mostly.
No, I don't think I was.
The Apollo Daphne story is really good. We'll have to do it again at some point. So um, the cosmos, if Marduk is taught, if the Marduk story is a real, think about like the Greek Titans. It's like before you have Zeus, before you have the world order that humans are thriving in under the rule of Zeus. This is like what comes about to make that possible. This is like really, really primordial forces at work, right? So the further back you go, the closer you get to the real basic primordial principles. So the idea of this Marduk story is that there's a great 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 grandfather and a great 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 grandmother. There's this masculine and feminine principle at the base of all being, because what happens before Marduk shows up is that there's this locked in a sexual love embrace are these two principles. It's a yin yang symbol. Think of it as remember like the ancient Greek gods eating their children for not being what they wanted them to be or something like that. And you can think of the dragons that come from the chaotic realm. Those are the bad sides of the conceptualized as masculine and feminine ultimate principles of reality as depicted in these stories. The good side of the two would be, the benevolent king and mother nature breastfeeding and giving us fruit from trees, right? So these characters are not good or bad. They're sometimes angry, right? It's are they in right relationship? Is the cosmos oriented properly so that they're not upset or something, or um something's going on. So those two are locked. It's like that's what being is just those two things. But then the children deities of these creatures kill their father. They don't want the thing that is imposing order and structure on it. They want something new and different than what was before, maybe some experimental possibilities to open up. And the problem is the mother, Tiamat, gets real pissed and decides to send, they live off the corpse of their dead father. And she is sending dragons and demons to destroy them, because it turns out if you get rid of, I mean, think about how simple it is. We got rid of the ordering principle and now we're left in chaos. Well, go figure, right? So monstrous things are attacking from every direction. There's chimeras and multi-headed things. There's no definition, male and female, up and down. Nothing is defined anymore because the chaos is on the rise. And what happens is another deity is born named Marduk, who's born to these gods who have, they've destroyed the order principle of this thing that was working, and maybe to make themselves more space, who knows, but it's a part of the progress story. In any case, they know that it's over for them and they're not going to make it. And then Marduk is born and he says, look, I will handle this problem. I'll solve the problem. But it comes at a cost. You got rid of something very important, and so it comes at a cost. There's going to be a hierarchy here. There's going to be some order again. I get to pronounce destinies. I'm the Zeus character. There's all these other gods, and they bring important things to the picture, but they're in the hierarchy of my court and my kingdom. Is basically the price that they have to pay. And of course, that is the price you have to pay. It's not like the story means Marduk was selfishly looking for advancement, although that might have been how people understood it. But it's like, well, what is the story saying? It's saying you got rid of the order principle. You need some order. And then Marduk has eyes all around his head. So the second thing we'll point out about the way he's interpreting these stories is he's using a Jungian approach where he says, look, okay, so Freud had this idea that you have ideas. They're propositional, well-defined ideas. They live in your mind, but you don't want to notice them. You want to repress them. You don't want to pay attention to them. And because of that, your brain, which wants you to notice them for one reason or another, encodes them in some sort of a story to smuggle them into your dream world. It's a part of your consciousness to try to make you face it in one way or another because it's something important for some reason. Jung's idea is that, well, that's just putting an arbitrary, again, we're not picking on Freud here, but the idea is that the arbitrary disguise could be a little arbitrary, right? I mean, you can look at the symbolism to try to figure out what the dream means, perhaps. But for Jung, the symbolism itself, so there's a distinction people use in this, and we may as well talk about it. So it's the difference between a sign and a symbol, okay? A sign says Disneyland next right. It's in text, and it tells you where to go to get to Disneyland. A symbol is an image of Mickey's ears, right? There's something about what you're looking for contained within the symbol. That's the difference, right? A symbol has something of the thing you're looking for within it, and that's how it points you towards the thing. Whereas a sign is just has nothing to do with where you're trying to go. It's just pointing you towards it, right? It's a cool distinction. So for Jung, it was symbolism. For Jung, there's actually you're relating to and touching the actual truth to a small degree when you're engaged in the symbols and in the narrative, right? It's told in that way, not arbitrarily because it's a coded language to point at something else. And what we should do is take all these myths and just decode them, and then we'll have straightforward language, and we won't need to read King Lear or Hamlet anymore because we know the point of the story. It's not like that. Instead, you have to meet King Lear. There's something about his way of being that you get to know through the story that has the actual value within it. And it might be, it's worth talking about. You can write lots of essays about King Lear and what we can learn about that story and what it means to us. Obviously, it's not throwing away philosophy or conscious propositional analysis. That's what we're doing. That's what Peterson's doing right now with the Marduk story. It's not saying that's unavailable, but what it's saying is the way you get the value from the story is directly in looking at what the symbols mean. So when there's eyes all the way around the head, one thing about Apollo is, and we'll have to do the story again, but his aim is sure, right? You can see the paintings. He's looking at the dragon that he has to slay, and he's unflinching about it, even though it's very much a parallel story here. And there is a Tiamat character in it. There is the other hero. Well, anyway, we won't go into that. It's too long. So let's look back at Marduk. So he's got eyes around his head. He's not refusing to look at things that are uncomfortable. Everybody else is terrified and cringing and afraid of where these monsters are coming from. He'll look right at them and face the thing that you can't comprehend because it's chaotic. And then he's throwing a net around it, right? He's cutting it into little pieces. He's saying, I can approach, like, imagine. So Apollo is also the god of medicine, by the way. Well, what does medicine have to do with this way of being in the world? Well, that's exactly what science is like. You're smashing your head up against an incredible ocean of chaotic insanity that you can't make sense of, and you're cutting it into little pieces until you can see connections and actually understand it. So you're using that chaos as the raw material for figuring out which plants do well and which do ill for humanity. Now you have medicine. You've created a better world out of the raw material of the thing that everybody else was too afraid to look at, right? So we're not going to say the story is reduced to something like that, but part of what the story's pointing at is that the hero that's necessary for the foundations of the world, by the way, is that which can approach the chaotic insanity that is a part of the raw material of being and look with magic words, with logos, right? It's the Hebrew story is that the Spirit of God is hovering over the chaotic waters. That's a bunch of potentiality. That means it isn't sticking around. If it was sticking around, it would be actual. To be potential means you could be something, right? But it's there. It's somehow there as the raw material, even though it's not a thing that can stick around, and speaking the logos into it. So Marduk has magic words and he has attention. And that the similarities between the stories is also a way of noticing, well, what it is that all the stories are getting at. So we won't go into the Apollo and Daphne one, but we will definitely do that at some point again. We've done it a few times, and it's really powerful. But in any case, we'll leave that aside right now. So we've talked about the Jungian points of, like, look at the symbols, they're actually saying something. So if you look at, so it, as a side note of the Apollo one, again, we're not going to get into it, but we're going to get into just the Jungian interpretation of the symbols. Why does Cupid have arrows? Apollo asks that question. He goes, baby, I have arrows, man. I slay dragons with my arrows. What the hell is a child and a stripling doing with a bow and arrow? Put it aside. Use flame. With that, the souls of lovers fry. He understands Venus. He understands Cupid's mother, lust and passion, but he doesn't understand sharp pain of love. And so if you're a materialist, you might just say, well, it's an arbitrary feature of the story or something like that. It's just as random as dreams could be. Maybe you might think that, you might not. If you're Freudian, maybe you'll say, well, it's a cultural artifact. And so if that appears in your dream, maybe that has something to do with what you're thinking about. I don't know. That's probably not fair to Freud. If you're a dream interpreter who's inclined to think that way, you might say something like that. But if you're Jung, you're saying, no, no, no. Arrows are sharp. Arrows come out of nowhere and suddenly hit you. When you stub your toe, you've got a lot you're doing in the world, but the sharp pain takes your whole world and reduces it just to this. This is now my world, and it's all I can think about. You don't know where the arrow might come from. It's not accidental that Cupid has arrows, right? Let's look at the symbol and see if it's saying something so profound to us that we can't just reduce it to the series of statements I just made. Maybe it's even more true than just that, and it means at least something like that about the nature of love as different from fiery lust and passion. So that's what he's doing. He's doing. So we'll pause because we really want to get this Jungian class that he's also smuggling into here, as well as we're going to pause and look at all the psychological stuff that he's got a lot of really powerful classes all hidden in this one series here. And we're going to pause for theology. We're going to pause for those other things. But we want to pause on this and say, okay, that's how the Jungians are deciding to approach the narrative. It's that I start with the presumption that there's something significant about the actual symbol used in the story. And I'm going to try to figure out what that is. Right? It's not an article of faith that it has to be the case, but that's where they're looking for the value, and in that way. All right, so that's probably a good side note.
It's staggering. When I read that story and started to understand it, just blew me away that it's such a profound idea. And we know it's true too, because we know in psychotherapy, for example, that you're much better off to confront your fears head on than you are to wait and let them find you. And so partly what you do if you're a psychotherapist is you help people break their fears into little pieces, the things that upset them, and then to encounter them one by one and master them. And so you're teaching this process of eternal mastery over the strange and chaotic world. And that all of that makes up some of the background. We haven't even got to the first sentence of the biblical stories yet. But
okay, one more quick comment. To understand Jordan Peterson and his approach, he's going into this crazy Jungian world and he thinks there's some value there. But notice that he wants to tie it into other sources of confirmation. So have I read the story correctly? Well, I got to wait 10,000 years to see if the story had value in me orienting myself in the world according to it led to thriving. I don't have that available to me, but I do have the last 10,000 years and the story is here. So there's some evidence that maybe it has some meaning, that type of thing. But what he's going to do beyond that is say, okay, how about my interpretation of the story? How about my attempt to extract from it propositional statements? Are those correct? Well, those could be subjected to philosophical, logical analysis, but also he's going to go to science and he's going to say, is the cutting edge of our scientific discovery pointing in the same direction as the thing that I think I detected in this story, right? So if I get a verification of this propositional idea, right? The story's not reduced to that propositional idea, but if I've taken that propositional idea and it isn't contradicted by science, that's good. Maybe I'd throw it out if it was, right? If it was a propositional idea with empirical consequence and the experiments showed it was wrong, then obviously it's wrong. I'm not sure how often you're going to get that type of an idea out of the story. But if you're taking an ethical or a characterological orientation propositional idea, it certainly has to be subjected to the ethicists and the debates and say, well, if what you got from the story is we should murder as many people as we can to reproduce as much of our genes as possible, maybe you got the wrong idea from the story, or maybe it's not a very good story, something like that, right? But beyond that, he thinks, Well, science is super valuable. What if I study clinical psychology? What if I study behavioral psychology? What if I look at what we're discovering in science? What about the broad consensus of many different camps of psychology? Are they pointing at this same truth? Were we benefiting from knowing that truth without knowing it explicitly or confirming it empirically? Was it benefiting us in a dreamlike understanding before we came to understand it in that way? And so what he's going to do is try to get the meaning out of the story. But then when 8 different fields of science confirm to him that this is probably a pretty profound reality because it works in all these other different restricted contexts that care about, certain outcomes and certain types of tests. If it's confirmed there, well, then now I've got something that I'm much more confident about. So that's one of the methods that he, as a thinker, is using. It's incredibly impressive. For a number of reasons, but we'll just pause and notice that for a second, and then we'll move on.
But all of that makes up the background. So you have to think that we've extracted this story, this strange collection of stories with all its errors and its repetitions and its peculiarities out of the entire history that we've been able to collect ideas. And it's the best we've been able to do. And I know there are other religious traditions. I'm not concerned about that at the moment because we can use this as an example, but it's the best we've been able to do. And what I'm hoping is that we can return to the stories in some sense with an open mind and see if there's something there that we actually need, and I hope that that will be the case. And as I said, I'll approach it as rationally as I possibly can. So, well, this is the idea to begin with, is we have the unknown as such, and then we act in it like animals act. They act first. They don't think, they don't imagine, they act. And that's where we started. We started by acting. And then we started to be able to represent how we acted. And then we started to.
Okay, I'm sorry. We started a half hour late, and usually we try to end at this time. So I'm going to hit a pause and just say, let's have a little bit of discussion to wrap up the last few minutes. And well, the first thing I want to ask is, do you want to continue for another half an hour since it's cut short by our starting late? Because he's about to get into some more stuff, and I think it'd be great to continue going, but we can certainly stop right now and jump into this. He's sort of set the background, and we can jump into this next time since this is usually the time we stop.
Let's save it for next time.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect place to stop. Okay, good. So let me just I'll write a timestamp down after. Okay, good. So so that's good. Sorry we started a half hour late, but I think we're starting to get into the swing of things here. I think this is just going to get better and better as we go. How did you feel about what he's been covering so far? Any reflections, things you want to talk about?
Well, I think he does an extremely well explanation of what he's trying to get at and how he's gotten there. And talking about, hey, we were right for looking at it from chimpanzees of this power dynamic, but then separating separating that from the physical being and then having it be abstract, this representation of power. Right. I mean, coming that entire journey in conclusion, I think is pretty important to point out, right? That isn't something just to ignore or to scoff at, and it's just a reminder of that we stand on the shoulder of giants who came before us, right? To get to this point where we're at, the complexity to be able to right, to do so in creating culture.
Yeah, He does do a good job of that. It's also, he needs to, because he's approaching this in such a strangely different way than what we're used to being told is an appropriate way to approach things. And so he's got to really go, he made the joke, hey, we haven't even gotten to the first line yet. Well, you can't. You can't get to the first line of reading Genesis the way you want to read it unless you clarify a whole bunch of things about how we're going to be approaching it, since nobody explicitly thinks that that's a legitimate way. I mean, even the people who are madly concerned with the Bible are half the time arguing that it's a science textbook and that it should be read in that type of a way. That's not how he is going to be reading it. It's, of course, not the way it's usually been read or what it's meant to people in most of the past. We're just in our scientism age. But even people who like the Bible or dislike it are not really reading it in this way, at least not explicitly, or they don't realize that's what they're doing. And for the ones who are doing it, and so it needs to be explicitly described to say, this is what I think is an appropriate way to approach things, and here's why. Especially since he's saying that in the context of, I'm submitting this to an academic community as well, right? What I mean is, Jordan Peterson is talking to everybody. And you can go to church and say, I believe X, Y, and Z, amen, brother, all the time, because you're in this small club of people who want to keep hearing that type of thing. But Jordan Peterson wants to talk about these things in a context which is submitted to the criticism of people who also think very differently about what these stories could mean, and what the appropriate way is to approach them. And so he's talking to everybody. He's talking to the world, quite literally. And so it's required to do that. What's awesome for us is and those of us that are interested in pragmatism, are interested in Jungianism, are interested in these other, children of existentialism, these other platonically inclined thought processes in our scientism age, is that we need to think about, well, how is it? Is it justifiable to approach? Could there be truth in the stories? What would the nature of that truth really be? Would it be like propositional truth? What do we do with it if we think we find it? How can we expect to approach it? I mean, we have to go over all of those things. And I like the picture you have of standing on the shoulders of giants. Usually the people who use that phrase are, of course, people, often scientists are like, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I think Newton plagiarized that quote, and he used it in an argument that he hadn't plagiarized something else. But in any case, you can imagine, like, how much science has progressed, and I get to stand on the shoulders of these giants of the past. Look how much we've built up. If you zoom out, it's like, yeah, that's a tiny little thing on top of this giant mountain of 250,000 years of people talking to each other about who we are and how we should be in the world in the language of narrative. And often, a scientismist is going to say, no, everything starts here, and look how high up I am. And this other perspective is saying, well, yeah, that's great. That's awesome. Let's see what that says. It's a very powerful language. We could even use it to criticize our ideas that we think we're getting from the stories. We're not binning it or throwing it out in any way, but it's built on a foundation that you're denying exists. And if you really want to get rid of it, this thing is going to crumble. This thing is made possible because of all of this underpinning. And also, we maybe are getting to, in our science, to understand things that confirm what the stories were implicitly telling us, even though we weren't explicitly able to understand what it was they were telling us. So all of that is priming our intuitions to think that maybe there's something of really profound value here in these stories. And so it serves a number of purposes, but it's also necessary. And I agree with you, he does a very good job of it. So we usually look at about 45 minutes of this at a time. We probably covered something like that today, maybe a little less. But we're going to have our discussions. They're usually going to go about an hour and a half with that 45 minutes in there. And this is our third meeting, and we're starting to get into the gist of it, I think. And it's going to get more and more exciting as we continue to go. So we'll see you next week at the same time, and we'll continue our dive into figuring out who Peterson is, what he's up to, and what might be valuable in the work that he's doing, which I think both of us suspect is quite a lot. But in any case, we'll continue that conversation next week at the same time. Thank you, everybody watching.